Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to answer James Holder's Miss Marple book tag, which I saw over on Brian's channel Bookish last week. It's a perfect tag to do this month before March Mystery Madness ends, despite the fact that my answers won't, in general, have anything to do with mysteries. And I'm going to try to do a fairly quick version, so let's get to the prompts. Each one begins with the name of one of Agatha Christie's novels from her Miss Marple series. The first one is The Murder at the Vicarage. Name a book about or set in a small town or village. My very favorite piece of writing set in a small town or village is actually a short story, Eudora Welty's Why I Live at the P.O., about the postmistress of the small town of China Grove, Mississippi. I did a reading of the hysterical story on this channel earlier, and I'll leave a link to that performance down below. For now, I'll point out that despite the fact that Welty's short story seems all about humor and gentle, loving mockery of ridiculously real-seeming characters, the story is also a retelling of the biblical story of the prodigal son. If you don't know the Welty story, go read it or go listen to it. It's fantastic and one of my very favorite stories. For the next title prompt, let's look at The Body in the Library. Name a book with a pivotal scene set in a library. I love all the talk of reading and time spent in libraries in Jane Eyre, but perhaps the most pivotal library moment is one that isn't about reading books. When Jane enters the library at Thornfield Hall to have her fortune read by a so-called traveling gypsy. What is divulged in the library helps Jane understand what's happening in her life, and it rather dramatically shapes the choices she makes as she goes forward. The next prompt is Title 3, The Moving Finger. Name a book in which the protagonist is trolled, harassed, subject to a rumor campaign, or falsely accused. I'll choose Hester Prynne from A Scarlet Letter. She's not exactly falsely accused, but she was wrongfully harassed, or at least unequally harassed, by her community. Nathaniel Hawthorne, though, gives her story a respect that her community does not. This is a book about dignity, even in the face of social shaming. I know a lot of readers hate this book, perhaps because so many high school English classes require it. If you haven't read it since grade school, give it another try. The next title prompt is A Murder is Announced. Name a book in which there's a sympathetic depiction of a Marxist or equivalent. I'm going to name two, one I've read and one I have not. The latter first. Although I've never read John Dos Passos, my father wrote his dissertation on Dos Passos back in the early 1960s. I'll name his character Mary French from the third book in his USA trilogy. Mary had been a student at Vassar and becomes a labor activist and a journalist. My understanding is that the book is about American life between World War I and the Great Depression. I've always been fascinated by the idea of having a male author writing during the early part of the 20th century, choosing to create his politically radical character as a woman. Have any of you read Dos Passos? What do you think? In the second book, the character is not as obviously a Marxist as I gather Mary French is. Still, the character is shaped by an author making a point about proletarian life and about women's particular experiences of hard work. And that book is Tell Me a Riddle by Tilly Olson. I loved this book when I first read it in late college or perhaps right afterwards. It's a collection of a few short stories and one novella. I highly recommend the opening story, I Stand Here Ironing, which grapples with the question of how the responsibilities of motherhood intersect with the difficulties of an unstable domestic life. The story is quite short, and it seems to be available online. I'll try to link to it down in the description box. As I said, I loved this book back when I was younger, but I was very recently reminded of Tilly Olson when I read one of my favorite books of 2020, the nonfiction study by Maggie Doherty entitled The Equivalents, A Story of Art, Female Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s. Olson is a fascinating writer, and I think I will talk about her a bit more in my next Reads and Rambles video. Number 5, They Do It With Mirrors, a book in which performance plays a major role. Perhaps this one is too obvious, or perhaps you'll ding me since calling it a book might not be exactly correct, but I will name Shakespeare's most famous play, Hamlet. The play within a play is, as the prompt title suggests, actually supposed to be a mirror of the events that set off the basic plot of Hamlet. It's a fulcrum moment when suspicions come out in the open, the plot takes a turn, and we know there's going to have to be a public reckoning of some sort. On to the next title prompt, A Pocket Full of Rye. Name a book based upon or inspired by a nursery rhyme, fairy tale, myth, or other work of fiction. I'll name The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which begins with a series of variations on the telling of a Dick and Jane story from a grade school early reader. To say The Bluest Eye was inspired by that particular text is obviously inaccurate. But Toni Morrison's choice to use that text in the beginning and throughout her novel was definitely an inspired and powerful choice. The 7th title prompt, The 450 from Paddington. Name a book in which more than 2 suitors pursue the main protagonist. In the example I'm going to choose, the story is really that the major protagonists pursue more than 2 potential targets. It's slightly more complicated than that because the story is set at a time when no matter how much a young woman wanted to pursue a man, she effectively has to trick them into pursuing her. The book I'm thinking about is Emma by Jane Austen. Emma tries to set up her friend Harriet, a young woman who she does not see as an equal, with assorted people in their community. Harriet has already been pursued by Robert Martin, but Emma decides that Harriet can do better. Emma then thinks that the slimy vicar is in love with Harriet, but in fact he's in love with Emma. Instead, Emma thinks she's falling in love with another character, and that doesn't last. Instead, she thinks Harriet has fallen in love with that same character. When it becomes clear that isn't true, the 2 young women more or less vie for yet another character who shall remain nameless in order to avoid spoilers of plot near the end of the book. I couldn't tell you who is pursuing who here. Perhaps Emma is the main pursuer, actually, even though she isn't trying to make romantic liaisons for herself always. The book is sort of a romance, sort of a screwball comedy, and sort of a story about becoming kind to other people and how to grow. It's definitely one of my favorites, as so many of the books I'm mentioning today are. Prompt number 8, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. Name a book about a changing world. Since I'm listing so many favorite books, here I'll list Middlemarch by George Eliot. There are many different kinds of social change happening in this large novel, but I'll point to one specific one, scientific reform. Tertius Lydgate is the model of a progressive scientist-physician, interested in questions and in scientific experimentation, rather than the more traditional kind of caring that doctors in the town of Middlemarch had long employed. Eliot isn't always clear that the advance of science or other progress is really a good thing. I find that interesting. Eliot herself was in many ways an independent woman, and she was in an untraditional relationship too. Still, we can see even from her life that there were also many ways she stuck to tradition. I've yet to read a biography of Eliot, but I'm really looking forward to picking one up sometime soon. The 8th prompt is a Caribbean mystery. Name a book about or set in the Caribbean. Jamaica Kincaid's novel, Annie John, came out when I was in college. One week, when I was lying in my dorm room trying to recover from bronchitis, some of my friends spent an evening at a local bookstore and came home with a couple of new novels for me, including this one. Annie John is very much a coming-of-age story, and it might even be called a YA book if it were written today. When it came out, it felt like a book engaged in questions of not only feminism, but anti-colonialism. A few years later, Kincaid published a nonfiction memoir called A Small Place, which includes a really fascinating analysis of how tourism works as a tool of colonialism and racism. Prompt number 10, At Bertram's Hotel. Name a book about artifice. I think I'll choose Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. We know from the beginning that this book is at least part satire and that it's about the artificial. The frame story is a puppet show, and it's told by an unreliable narrator. The protagonist of the book is Becky Sharp, although she's really an anti-hero in many ways. Throughout the novel, she uses her talents and her charms to seduce wealthy men into her lair. She isn't pursuing them because she's romantically interested in them. She's pursuing them for her own gain, and sometimes even because the game seems to keep her entertained. Becky Sharp is the bad girl we love to hate, and that we actually might find ourselves caring about at some points, despite all of her trickery and lies. The next title prompt is Nemesis. Name a book featuring a quest. I'll name a children's book here, Susan Cooper's Over Sea, Under Stone, the first in the Dark is Rising series. I read the book when I was a young girl, but I remember it best because I read a lot of it aloud to my younger brother a few years later. I read it again when my own child was young. Over Sea, Under Stone is kind of a mystery, actually, appropriate for this tag, I guess. Anyway, it's the story of the Drew children, who find an old document in the vacation home they're living in and think it's a map of a local coastline. It turns out to be connected to the story of King Arthur and the Holy Grail. I'd love to know if any of the rest of you have read this one, either when you were young or with your own favorite children. And we've come to the final of the title prompts, Sleeping Murder. Name a book in which the past haunts the present. Very recently, I've mentioned William Faulkner a few times in different contexts on this channel, and I've read out his famous line, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past." And certainly, history haunts the lives of Faulkner's characters, both black and white. I'll choose Absalom, Absalom for my answer here, although pretty much any of his books would work. The past that echoes in the present of Absalom, Absalom is both a cultural history of the region, a local history of the specific area where the characters grow up, and an intensely personal history. And of course, they're all braided together. All that's left to do is to tag a few people. Although I did this tag in honor of March Mystery Madness, I realize I'm putting it up too late for new folks to do it in March. Still, it's a great tag with a lot of flexibility, and it definitely can work for any time of the year. I've discovered several really fine, fairly new booktubers quite recently, and I thought I'd tag several of them today. In a future tag, I'll mention a few other small channels I love, which I've known for a little longer. If you are a viewer who has not watched and subscribed to these channels, I highly suggest you do. If you're one of these small booktubers, please feel no pressure at all to answer this particular tag. I'm tagging you not because I actually want to see how you answer these particular questions, but to tell you how much I appreciate you adding your voices to this special community. So this week, I'd like to tag Beating Around the Books, Bob the Bookerer, Rosie Cockshut, Pete's Pensive, Drawn to Stories, Gina Stanier Books, Books with Elvis, and Revenant Reads. All of these fantastic channels have roughly 250 subscribers or fewer, some many fewer than that. I'll leave their links below down in the show notes. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much, James, for creating this somewhat challenging tag with such clever questions. Thanks, Brian, for bringing it to my attention. And thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.